So I was talking to some people in a chat, and they were asking about my claims about the Hebrew calendar. So I'm just going to do a quick overview. If you want charts that I have that help display this information, I have them in PDF form, and as well as Microsoft Whiteboard, which is what I'm going to be using right now. But I'm just going to do a brief overview. If you would like them, just leave a comment in this video after it's streamed in the permanent comment section, not the live comment section, if you see this later, and I'll get back to you, and I'll we can email them to you. So this is the reason. Let's see, this is the main reason. I'll try to just demonstrate it fairly quickly. I have other videos that go over it more carefully, but so let's start here. My claim is that the time prophecies in Daniel, at least the ones mentioned in Daniel 7 to 12 that come back up in Revelation, are not literal, nor can be literal unless the Bible's not accurate. This is a chart from a futurist right here. And people are very confused about this, how this works, and separating symbols from literal narrative, and the genre difference and context. People are very confused about this. I probably don't get it perfectly the way I might say it, but it's something like, look, we forget often when we're obsessed with prophecy, like what's actually a symbol and what's we just automatically fill in as our description or our interpretation. So when I say it literal, I mean, is the time period as written in the text to be taken as literal, not representing something symbolic? Most futurists and preterists, in fact, they have to say these periods, which are mentioned in Revelation, are future and have not occurred yet and are rendered in literal time. Why? Well, look, as you can see, they say the 3.5 years is the 42 months, is the 1260 days, is the times and half the time. They are the same thing, or they don't necessarily always mean the same thing being referenced in history necessarily, but as increments, yeah, they're right. On a lunar calendar, a purely lunar calendar, 3.5 years is 42 months, right? 12 months in a year times 3 is 36, plus 6 months, a half a year, it's 42 months, right? We have 42 months and 3.5 years on our calendar today. So does a purely lunar calendar. If every month had 30 days in it, which it does on a lunar calendar, a purely lunar calendar, 42 months times 30 days is 1260 days. Or time times and half a time is 1 plus 2 plus half. That's 3.5 years. Okay. So how much, I mean, I have futurists telling me, how much more obvious could it be if they're all the same thing? They're talking about the same thing. 3.5 years is 42 months, is 1200. Yes, it is. But it comes from symbolic prophecy that is not to be taken literally. How do I mean, unless you think the prophecies weren't given for the Jews, they associate this time period with the 70th week of Daniel, which they don't realize is already fulfilled. What do I mean? I mean, they put a gap between the end of the 69 weeks, the beginning of the 70th week, and they put the cross in the gap, which means, by the way, would technically mean Jesus isn't the Messiah, because 70 weeks are determined to make atonement for iniquity. And if you put Jesus' death, which makes the atonement for iniquity and ratifies the covenant, if you put the cross outside of the 70 weeks, he doesn't fulfill making atonement for iniquity, meaning you may say he's Messiah, and I believe you believe that, but he just failed 1 Corinthians 15 according to the scriptures, right? But the classic Protestant view, which has the 70th week right after the 69th, makes the prophecy actually fit how they counted time in history from the proper decree, which is associated with Jubilee cycles and sabbatical cycles. And when understood how they actually keep time from 457, one of the most proven dates from, in archaeology, from archaeology for various reasons I won't get into. From that decree, which actually restored them to run the Torah from the temple. After that decree, they gave them the judges to go back to execute the death penalty from the temple with the judges. From that decree until Jesus' ministry is exactly 483 years. And then 3.5 years later, Jesus died, confirming the covenant by his death. Brought in the new covenant, put the sacrifice and oblation to cease, at least in the sense where the sacrifices for sins was over the day Jesus died. They might have killed animals in some building, but it wasn't what the Bible's talking about when it says he put the oblation to end. God doesn't care about, people kill animals every day. Once the Son of God has been killed, what the Bible's talking about with sacrifices, over. Or did you think Jesus isn't the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world? Maybe not. I think his one sacrifice for all is kind of this big deal. Okay, so that all being said, what is it? Here's a lunar year, 12 months, 30 days every month, 360 days in a year. So 3.5 years would be 1260 days. The problem is the Jews, including during the time of Daniel writing Daniel down, all the way through history, through those, the decree of Artaxerxes, through that history, which they would have been keeping with a non-lunar calendar. And the New Testament shows that they were in expectation of the Messiah, because that's what the prophecy is for, Daniel's 70 weeks. We know how they counted years. We know they had one Passover per year, not one Passover every 360 days, okay? Which all these people try to modify the time period to make it work. There's only one way it works, and it's 457, okay? And that's actually right, because it actually is the right decree, and it's actually leads up perfectly to when Jesus was baptized. And counting the time right. So anytime you see someone trying to convert to 360 days, literal days, and then times it by the years and get 177,000 days and then convert it back to years, that's total nonsense. Total nonsense, for sure. So what does that mean? It means if you're a preterist and you're trying to cram it all back in the past, can't do it. Unless you're willing to falsify the Bible, of course. It also means futurism is false. Because unless somehow God modifies the solar system so that the calendar goes back. But the problem with that is that if that half of the 70th week, if you're associating that with the 70 weeks of Daniel, we know what how those 70 weeks are to be counted from the 457 decree, the way the Jews actually kept a year. They didn't keep one Passover every 360 days. They kept one Passover once per seasonal year. From month to month within the year, it was based on the lunar cycle, the sighting of the moon. But because they need the Passover and the Feast of Weeks to be in the right season, because it was associated with the crops, so it must be in the spring, they adjusted the calendar, which I'll explain now. So if they had been using a 360 days in a year calendar in that period from the decree to when Jesus showed up, they would have had one Passover, and then 360 days later, if you want to claim this is a literal calendar they're using, like as it's written in Daniel, according to a purely lunar calendar, that would be 360 days a year, which means they would have one Passover, and then 360 days later, they'd have another Passover. And then 360 days later, they'd have another Passover. If they're going to be doing the calendar as literally given in Daniel, which they don't. But if they did, it would be one Passover, one festival every 360 days, one a year, right? Well, the problem with that is it can't work according to Scripture, because a true year has 365 days in it. that's how often the lunar cycle, a year of lunar cycles, or you could say a seasonal year or an astronomical year or a true solar year, which the seasons are based on the sun, it would be off by 5.2524 days. Okay. So if you kept doing a 360-day year, you would fall 5 days behind, and then 5 more, and then 5 more. And within 3 years, you'd be a month and a half off. And that's basically enough to already make it so the festivals can't work, because it's associated with the crops and with the lambs being born. So we know how they kept the calendar. They added a 13th month every 7 out of 19 years. And some other adjustments that would be made too as well, according to other festivals, on like being set up in such a way where they could take a day away 1 month or add a day. And those months would, I'll show that here. Those months would have, let's see. So the months would have 29 or 30 days per month. Here's the months listed. So let me read this part to you. I'll read some of this to kind of explain how this works. The Hebrew calendar is lunar solar. It's lunisolar. Because it's from month to month. It's based on the lunation cycles, but there's adjustments made to keep the festivals in line with the seasons based on a lunar, or based on the solar or the seasonal year. So it's both. It's lunisolar. Always was. Has to be. At least from Daniel's time on. And something major would have to happen to shorten the length of the year, which is possible, but we know that didn't happen during the period of history that the Jews were using the calendar. So we know how my claim is that this proves a day for a year has to be the interpretation, which I'll get into more after I show the calendar a little bit more here. The Hebrew calendar is lunisolar, meaning the months are based on the lunar. The months are lunar, but years are based on solar years, which makes it so much easier once you realize that to like align the biblical time periods or timeline with other historical things, which a lot of work has been done to do that. So it's like logically, historically, biblically, the archaeological evidence, the scholarly work all says this isn't contested. There's no contesting this. There's no, it's not true. This is just logically has to be the case. Biblically has to be the case. Yeah, etc. The calendar year features 12 lunar months of 29 or 30 days, because the lunar cycle is not perfectly 30 days. It's 29.5 days on average. So 29 or 30-day months with an intercalary lunar month added periodically to synchronize the 12 lunar cycles with the longer solar year. In other words, it's about 11 days short on a year with 12 months. Well, let me keep reading. They would sight the moon, which would start a month, and then the next month would be based on sighting the moon. But then and then I'll explain the other part. The mean period of the lunar month, or the synodic month, is very close to 29.5 days long, a lunation cycle. According to basic Hebrew calendar, year is one of 12 lunar months alternating between 29 and 30 days. So when you do this, and then you have the 9th, I think, or the 8th and 9th month, they would add or subtract a day based on the sighting of the moon and keeping certain festivals from falling on the weekly Sabbath. Some of them that wouldn't be a concern, but those would be adjusted. That's why there's a plus or minus 1 day. So you get 353 or 354 or 355, or otherwise known as 354 on average days per year when there's 12 months, plus or minus 1 day, depending on how the weekly Sabbath cycle happens to fall once the moon is sighted in particular months. That one of those months could have 29 or 30, and then the next one would have 30 or 29, depending on that. So you could get plus or minus 1 day, 354 plus or minus 1 day. Now, to try to make this more brief, again, a purely lunar calendar like Islam or the Muslims that would use does have that issue I mentioned where it falls out of season because they use a purely lunar calendar and they don't do adjustments for the sun. I don't know. They must have to at some point, but that's why like it isn't in the same season every year. Certain holidays, it's problematic. That wouldn't work for the Jews, of course. Now here's how they add a 13th year to try to kind of show this. So that's like, I think they call it like the Metonic cycle or something. Anyways, it's a 19-year cycle, okay? And this actually makes it very accurate. Here's 19 blocks, top to bottom, left to right, reading it, just to show how you would space it out. 7 out of every 19 years would have a 13th month added. So you're 11, I'll read it here. Since the sum of 12 lunar months is about 11 days short of an actual seasonal year or true solar year, a leap month is added every 2 to 3 years or 7 times out of a 19-year cycle. This keeps the calendar in step with astronomical seasons and makes sure the religious observances occur in the correct time of year, as mentioned in the Torah. When they add the 13th month, 7 out of every 19 years or every 2 or 3 years, okay? That extra month is always 30 days. So depending on, so you're 11 days short of a true solar year in the 12-month years. The years with 12 months in them will be about 11 days short of a true solar year. And usually there's 2 12 years with 12 months in it in a row, and then you'll get a 13. So you'll be 11 behind and then 22 days behind, approximately. And then you get 30 days added, and that knocks you 8 days ahead. You were 22 days behind a solar year from a particular starting point, let's say. And then that puts you over because you have a 384 days in the 13-month year. So it's kind of like cycling above and below, which actually keeps it, tight with say a true solar year or current calendar. So, because it's like, what would that be, like 20 days over a true solar year? So it's like 11 under, and then 30 over, or I guess it'd be like 20 over. And then you go under the next year and then under again. And by the way, this is another, I think, main argument about the 42 months is the 3.5 years is the 360 or 1260 days. Well, that's true. They're talking about the same thing. But if you notice, wherever you start a 3.5 year period in the cycle of years, you can never get 42 months in 3.5 years, no matter when you start. You either have 43 months at minimum, because the best you can do is start on a 12, and then you're going to have a 13th month year, which is going to put you over 42. You're going to have 43. And then if you started, say, here, like this year, you'd actually have 44 months in a 3.5 year period. So you never in Jewish history is there a 3.5 year period that actually has literally 42 months in their literal history. So the 3.5 years cannot be 42 literal months. Cannot be. Because we know they didn't have that calendar. End of discussion. And I've done the math. When you look at how many days would be in it in a 3.5 year period, I couldn't make it equal 1260, no matter where I started with the different year lengths. Like it doesn't sum to no matter even if you let it be 353, 54, 355, and you just use any one you possibly can, and then add the 384, 385, or 383. You can't make it land on 1260. It's not possible. And Daniel would have known what kind of calendar they were using. when he wrote those time periods in? Do you think he knew they weren't using a lunar calendar? A purely lunar calendar? Seems like you would. Because we know that they didn't have one. So, in other words, if it was to be taken literally, why is it embedded in this apocalyptic literature, which is pure symbolism, which is easy to forget? Why does it use increments of time that we know they didn't use in Jewish history, literally, at least from Daniel's time forward until now, even to this day, they didn't use the lunar calendar? Did God just get this wrong? Was he just being kind of loose with it? Like, yeah, but 3.5 years, whatever. Well, if it's supposed to be literal, sorry, you say it's literal, it has to be 1,260 days. Or it fails the prophecy if it's literal. It's not literal. Yes, the 12 months or the 3.5 years is the 42 months in the symbolism, is the 3.5 years is the 42 months, is the 12, but it's long periods of time, a day for a year, which fits the sweep of time that Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 is laying out, one successive kingdom after the other over long periods of time. I think I'll leave it at that. If you take the Bible seriously and that the Bible's accurate, and it is, you must relinquish that belief, because we know historically the Jews didn't use that sort of calendar. So if you want any of this information in more detail or in a chart form, just let me know. We can understand Bible prophecy. There's many people explain it much better than I do, as far as I can tell, and no futurist will seem to want to contend with this. They'd rather just keep teaching their false views, pretend like nothing to see here. We know the Adventists are wrong. After all, Ellen White's a false prophet. And Jesus has changed the Sabbath to the Lord's Day, apparently. Nope, sorry. Here I stand. Who